Alright, so I was just driving my truck, and on the way back from a long delivery, I noticed it was starting to squeak, but a new squeak. I didn't know what it was, but you could tell, like, you could hear the squeak. It was like squeak, squeak, squeak. It was going with like the speed of the tires. Pretty much positive this needs something because that's so hot I can't even keep my hand on it. Is the brake hot? Is my brake sticking? No, the brakes aren't sticking. This needs a wheel bearing. Alright, so you can see that's what a bad wheel bearing looks like. And it only had a little bit of a squeak. But I know my truck, I knew what that squeak was. I knew it didn't have any sounds. That little squeak let me catch this before I ended up broken down somewhere. Need a little bit of play. It shouldn't be that tight. See, so you can see how this bearing, it's got slop in it. See, this is a bad bearing. Now it's good I caught this before this fell apart though. The brakes are holding it. All right, so that's what that looks like. There's the inner bearing. All right, I almost got it. Let me show you what it looks like coming out. Okay, look in here how they give you this spot right there. That's for knocking out this race, because otherwise there's not enough to get a punch on it. Okay, so now it's time to kind of inspect everything. So the things you're looking for, one, the bearing surfaces. So you want to check for like burrs or something that will keep the bearing from seating down all the way. So we're in good shape here. Same thing on the spindle. You want to check where the bearings go. Make sure there's no huge gouges or anything. Now, in this case, since I caught it before the bearings were completely bad, you know, everything's fine. But what will happen, a lot of people would ignore that. You know, there's a lot of people out there have no idea how vehicles work, and, you know, they'd hear that squeak, that little bit of squeak is all it took for me to realize there was a problem. But some people, they would just ignore that forever, and what would happen is the bearings would disintegrate to nothing, and then the bearings would chew right through the spindle until the wheel falls off, and then you'd be buying, you know, a spindle, you'd probably be buying the hub and the bearings, and you'd probably have a big inconvenience and a tow bill. So that's why it's good to catch this stuff beforehand. All right, and as far as parts, so I need to clean this up a little better, but my brakes, you know, that's plenty on there. I actually did brakes in this a few years ago, so not gonna mess with those. The bearings, outer bearing, the small one, our inner bearing, and our grease seal, which here's the grease seal that came apart. Okay, so as far as getting parts for this thing, usually going to Ford and asking for parts is worthless. I don't think Ford had much to do with making this truck, and they didn't make these medium duty trucks that long. I mean, I think they're Sterling now or something, but going to the local Ford dealer is completely worthless. So usually the best way to get parts for this thing is to just look for part numbers on the parts themselves. Oh, there, okay, right there. Bauer USA, so we got a brand. Here's a long part number there, very easy to read. Another shorter number here. And here's our seal. Okay, all right, yeah, we got a number on there as well. Okay, cool, we got lucky. All right, so let's try to get these parts. So this is what I got from the Fleet Pride Trucks place. So they had the new seal, the outer bearing, which was the one that was bad, and they did not have the inner bearing, but they had the outer race. So I got that, and new studs and lug nuts, and they didn't have that either. All right, let's put this back together. All right, so here is the brand new race. Alright, so here's a brass punch. Alright, so you can see that other race that's set all the way. Let's put the side in. Alright, that's set all the way. Alright, so the guy sold me this grease, saying this is better. Alright, so here's that other bearing. This one's fine. There's no slop in this one like the front had. Let's just put some new grease on it. Goes right there. All right, now these really aren't supposed to be that tight. So let me just tighten it up. Just to make sure everything's set properly. Now it's turning a little bit stiff. So I'll just back off a little bit. And I'll just put it right about there. All right, that turns nice. And not a drop of play in it. All right, so I wanted a new one of these, but all the ones at the place were made out of plastic, and then they stuck out like that much. That would just get smashed off instantly. So this one, it's got this hole. Let me just weld that hole closed and clean this up, and this will be all right. All right, that'll be fine. There's no more hole in it. So I know it's tempting to just put this right back in it, but when this happens, just change these. These are cheap enough. So what you do is you get it started. And then just run it in like this. Okay. All right, that's on there. They're all tight. Now sometimes it's a little tricky to get these on straight, but I think I got it there. All right, well, that's fixed. Let's go try this thing out. Now to adjust the slack adjuster. All right, so the way this works, this air can here pushes this brake to make it move. And there's an adjustment. So what you do is you push in that collar, and then tighten this up. And see what's happening. Watch it right here. So what that does is it rotates that thing. I backed it off quite a bit, so let's see, that's probably too much. Actually, that'd be right there. Truck has a bunch of grease fittings on it. Let's grease it up. I just greased all the suspension and steering and drive shaft and dump body hinges. Let's just check the wheel bearing on this side to make sure it's still tight. Look at that. Thing is tight. All right, so what you're doing here is you're shaking it. And you're going, what you're doing is you're feeling and you're listening. And when it's bad, there'd be like a click, 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 and you'd feel and hear it. This thing, that is perfect. All right, you're not just checking wheel bearings when you're doing this shakedown test. You're also checking ball joints. So like top to bottom, that would be ball joints. Then for steering components, you go this way. And this thing is as tight as it can be. I've seen cars a few years old, and you jack them up and you go click, 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 click. Or Jeeps. Every time, I used to drive Jeeps for years. Every time I'd be working on my Jeep, you jack it up and it'd be like click, click, click. The thing would be like, you'd be buying like bearings and every part, like every time you'd be messing. You wouldn't even be working on that. You just like all of a sudden you'd be jacking it up to do something completely else, and it'd be sloppy. All right, this thing is fixed. Let's go take it for a drive. doing this thing. You know, it's not four-wheel drive, so it's just knock out the old bearings and put in new ones. A lot of other stuff is just like that, even small things like ATVs. So a few tips after doing a bearing like that, you know, maybe after driving for a week or so, just jack the truck up and just make sure there's no play in that wheel in case that nut needs to be adjusted. The other thing you'd want to check too is just, I mean, that seal I put in there was brand new, and but just check to make sure that grease isn't leaking out of there. You know, that's a big deal, especially DOT. That's one thing they're always looking for. I mean, because it's important. If the grease is leaking out of there from the inside onto the brakes, that means the brakes aren't working. So since that's all brand new, just in case maybe something got done wrong, I'm just going to keep an eye on that for a while. Especially that since that grease I used was pretty thin. The guy was telling me, he's like, oh, it's kind of like a grease, kind of like an oil. Because I was debating switching out that grease cap with an oil cap and then putting oil in these front wheels instead. You know, I figured, oh, maybe that would work better. But since the thing came with grease, I just kind of left it that way with the original cap on it.